Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Adi Achint. I'm here to talk about the Ukraine war update. There's a lot which is happening in Ukraine. There's a lot which is happening on the sidelines of the Ukraine war. And I wanted to talk to you about what exactly is taking place. We have to cut the clutter. We have to beat around the narrative. We have to remove all sorts of propaganda stories which are going across this war and telling us something probably which is not happening on the ground. Thank you so much for joining me. And of course, thank you so much for trusting me with your time and the information that I will give you. Before I begin, I'd like to request you hit the like button, do check your subscription, switch on the notifications. And of course, yes, if you can help, please do support the Dev Talks effort. It takes a lot of effort for me to actually get and collect the kind of data that I'm going to be presenting to you. Uh, Help me out in my effort, and let's see where this whole thing can go forward. Now, I've got a small presentation that I've made for you, but before that, I want to get into the maps. Map reading has become one of the biggest pastimes of the Ukraine war, and I have kind of got a particular map which will give you a certain set information as to what is happening there. I'll give you a sort of a bird's eye perspective as to what is happening in Ukraine. So, without further ado, just allow me to switch on the map, share the screen with the map that I have got for you. Give me just a second, and here we go. You will now start seeing a map here, as we can see on the screen. The main fighting in Ukraine, as we see, is happening in the east, where we see all this blue and the red marks over here. You can see the concentration of Ukrainian forces, especially in the area of Kharkiv in the northwest. You can see some concentration of Russian forces around here. Of course, let me tell you, these maps, I'm just showing you as a pictorial reference. It is difficult to place on certain units with others because this is a moving situation. What you see in the lighter part in this particular shade right here, right next to the city of Donetsk, which is, as I'm zooming in, is the part which is basically the borders of the DPR, or the Donetsk People's Republic. And that is where the Russians are basically planning to claim or go up to. There are two major cities which are under battle right now. One is the city of Bakhmut, which is basically around here. Then there is a city of Crimea, which is around here. And then you've got these two cities, which are Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. These are like two twin cities which would form sort of a battle line defense for the Ukrainian army in this particular region. Donetsk, which you can see right here, is the capital of the DPR, has been facing a huge amount of shelling, as claimed by the Russians, which is being done by the Ukrainian army itself. It's causing a huge amount of damage to civilian life in this particular region. Let's kind of move forward towards uh, the, the contentious area of Zaporizhia, which is in the southern part of Ukraine. You can actually see some little concentration of Ukrainian forces. There have been attacks happening in this particular region on on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. Dnieper River, if you can see, is going down right here, right next to Zaporizhia. These attacks have not really been very fruitful for the Ukrainians, and so one can see them moving away a little bit towards further west. This is another place where we see some action taking place and constant fighting in this particular region. The Ukrainians had actually started off and made a breakthrough right down to the Dnieper River in the initial parts of his offensive, where they found a gap within the Russian lines. Today, the reports are that these lines are now basically stagnant. They've not really moved much. The Russian artillery has come into place, and it seems, as President Putin mentioned in his speech, a lot of backup in terms of Russian soldiers has come in. There was a offensive that was some sort of an offensive, about 4, 5, 600 men, that was conducted day before yesterday, which resulted in not much of a movement of the line. One wonders why, in such a broad front, was offensive conducted with very few people. This is the city of Kherson right here on the western part of southwestern part of Ukraine, which is what is being under contention, and the Ukrainians are basically wanting to get this city into their control, so that they could kind of show some sort of a big victory in terms of the the war which is ongoing in this area. As a matter of fact, this is the Kerch Bridge, which got blown up some time back. I will talk to you about that. There's some interesting news that has come around. So this on is basically a bird's eye view. I mean, of course, I we could get inside each and every city, each and every map, each and every town, and there's just so much happening in this particular war. But I want to give us a bird's eye view of what is happening, which area the fighting is taking place, and what are the developments. The developments I didn't discuss to you with the map. I've actually made a presentation. We will go through that presentation and point by point actually go through what is happening in the city, in the country. So as I said, the Ukrainian war update. This again is a simple map for you, which shows you the entire country. The part in the yellow was something that the Russians had on the borders of the city of Kharkiv. In the last offensive, the Ukrainians kind of took it back. I will talk to you about this particular offensive because in the analysis of this one offensive, there is a big factor which basically affects the entire offensive, and the style that the offensive would be conducted has been, you know, has one big factor has been not discussed at all, and that is something that is very interesting to me. As I said, this is the Kerch Bridge in the bottom end of the screen. All the yellow parts in the map have erstwhile Russian occupied territories. Pardon my throat, I'm just having a little bit of a bad time with my throat. Let's move forward. So these are the regions where basically a lot of fighting, as I showed you in the other map, which is taking place. What the Ukrainians are basically trying to do is to occupy the city of Kherson, which is on, as I said, the southeast part of the country. They want to drive a wedge right through the Dnieper River so that they can surround the Russian troops in this particular region and probably cut off the road link which has been established by the Russians to supply Crimea and the troop and the population which is there in that particular region. So this is what it is. Let's move forward to the second slide. This, as I showed you earlier, is the Zaporozhye region. This is where a lot of the fighting is taking place today. A couple of failed offensives, a couple of current small probing attacks which are taking place. By the looks of it, and the kind of forces that the Ukrainians are currently using in this particular area, and the reports that are coming out from Ukrainian and Russian channels, is the factor that the amount of forces is about 3, 4, 500 men. Now, what the Ukrainians are actually talking about is these are probing attacks where we are trying to check what kind of defenses that the Russians are having, sort of reconnaissance attacks, but it kind of does not make sense where 500 men would go in for a reconnaissance attack and be such a large force that could be spotted very clearly. It kind of doesn't make sense. So these were probably probing attacks where they tried to test certain defenses. Probably the situation got a little out of hand. I'm not very sure because I don't get direct reports from that entire region. This is the eastern sector, which is, as I had shown to you, which is close to this Oskal River in the northeastern part of Kharkiv, where a lot of the fighting took place during this big counteroffensive, which was sort of a lightning attack that the Ukrainians took place. We can still see a lot of small blue arrows which are actually coming in and conducting daily attacks. Having said that, the Russians were not very clear, were not very sorted in terms of their lines in this particular region. What we see today is that reports coming out of these attacks being repulsed. And when I'm saying reports coming out, you can just go through the Russian channels, you'll see them. You also need to corroborate that particular thing with Ukrainian channels to kind of come to a center point somewhere. Of course, it's very difficult for one to kind of figure out what exactly is happening. There are these maps which are available. There is so much stuff which is there, but to decipher them, that's one of the reasons why I'm not going to put my money on which town, where, and this and that. Having said that, the general area and the battle which is taking place in that general area can be studied here. Guys, if you have some thoughts, please do send in your thoughts as comments, as questions. Please do share your thoughts in the comments, and if you do like the video, please hit the like button. It's a lot of data that I'm going to present to you so that we can all understand what is happening. So a slide here, what I'm going to discuss is what we see happening overall in the battlefront. there is intensive Russian missile attacks. As a matter of fact, in the first day, there are reports of about 202 or 207 missile attacks that have taken place within Ukraine. These attacks, as per both the parties of the war, talk about critical infrastructure in terms of energy, in terms of transportation, in terms of ammunition and military infrastructure, which has been hit and destroyed during these attacks. Today morning, we saw some drone attacks happening in Kiev. These drones have been much in discussion, and I'll kind of come. I'm sure you can see by the end of the slide. I'm going to talk about this drone. So let's just put a pin in it and put it on the side. One thing that I'd like to mention is that during the first phase of the missile attacks, what the Russians did was to take out the air defenses of Ukraine along with the electricity grid. Uh, remember, the air defense of systems of Ukraine, a lot of them in terms of the comms would be running on the electricity grid. So if that goes out, there's going to be a little bit of a break. We all know what's happening with the Starlink. I will also discuss that with you. There's a bit of a challenge that I think the Ukrainians are going to start facing in terms of the Starlink. There are certain reports, and this has been mentioned by some very prominent American Ukraine war commentators, that 80% of the air defense of Ukraine has been impacted during these attacks. 580 cities, towns, or villages, electricity has been damaged. And as a matter of fact, just about 10 minutes before I came on this live session, President Zelensky put out a news and said that, and this was covered by ANI, he said that a third of the electric infrastructure of Ukraine has been destroyed. And that is something very relevant and very, very interesting to hear from him as well, who was, Ukraine has been trying to brush off these attacks, saying that not much has been damaged in terms of this thing. And they're also saying that we've shot down most of the rockets. So a statement coming from President Zelensky itself cannot, it cannot be taken lightly, and it just shows the damage that is being done by these kind of attacks that have been taking place. An interesting development which has happened is the factor that drones have been used. These so-called Iranian drones. I'm not sure. I'll talk to you about that, as I said in the next point. Have been used. The Russians call them Geran. It is Geran 2. These things have been spotted over Ukraine. I'm sure all of us who watch this war carefully or are on Twitter have seen Ukrainian security forces trying to shoot them down, firing guns in the air. It's quite a desperate situation when you look at that, because it's a drone. You don't know where it is targeted, and if there are civilians at the bottom, it kind of becomes a very dangerous scenario for all of them to kind of figure out where to go during these attacks. Iranian Shahed drones are much in discussion. There are rumors about Russia having purchased these drones from the Iranians for a very cheap price. As a matter of fact, the price ranges between about $2,000 to $20,000 in terms of these battlefield drones that have been used. They're also called loitering drones or kamikaze drones. As a matter of fact, the Russians call them Geran 2. Now, the origin of this particular drone has been in question for a while. Let's just talk about it. It is the Shahed 136. It's got a maximum range of about 2,500 kilometers, a maximum speed of about 115 miles per hour. That is 185 kilometers. And of course, the warhead weight is about 50 kg. So it's not that big as a this thing. But please understand, these are drones that are flying through civilian areas. It gives a shock of the life in terms of the effect to the civilians in that particular region. Now, I don't know if you guys can read the line at the bottom. It says, whose is it? Russia, Iran, or a joint venture? If you ask the Russians or the Iranians, they say, no, we've not done any sort of arms transfer between these two guys. It is very, very simple that there is some sort of a deal that is taking place. Now, what I'm hinting at is either it's a joint development that has happened, or the Russians have realized that these drones are pretty inexpensive and could be used in a large quantum where they are wanting to actually make a difference in the battlefield. Now, a lot of us might just ask that, are the Russians actually running out of weapons? Are the Russians running out of missiles? Are the Russians running out of ammunition for their war effort? And I'll talk to you about this. There was a study done by a British college, a British think tank, who talks about the kind of weapon production that happens in the West versus Russia. So we'll discuss that as we go forward. Again, what we are seeing overall is drones of very small size. It was interesting to see that the Ukrainian forces were firing handled what do you call guns and stuff like that. There was a report somebody sent me a while ago that one of these drones was also taken out by a manpad. So there is a lot of effort I think the Ukrainians are putting in to understand how to counter this particular threat. It is something which is going inside Ukraine and hitting Kiev. So that is something I think the Ukrainians are a little nervous about at this moment. With the air defense gone in Ukraine, it becomes, as it is very difficult to kind of counter these attacks. There are missile attacks, there are drone attacks, there's shelling, and there's, of course, aerial bombing which is taking place. So there's a whole lot of series of air attacks that the Ukrainians are currently dealing with. Uh, the reason, again, I say that the Ukrainians have kind of come down in terms of their air defense capabilities is because you look at how they are kind of dealing with these drones. Either it is a desperate effort to push them down by firing these guns, but they must realize when they're firing these AK-47s or whatever they've got in their hands, these are small size, small gauge bullets. They don't travel that far. Of course, when they go up, they're also going to come down. They might just hit an innocent civilian on the road and might just cause certain damage to civilian infrastructure, which would be, collateral sort of damage which would be done by Ukrainian forces itself. And of course, the biggest hint of all is President Zelensky, sorry, has been asking for air defense systems since the first day of the raid. Sorry, that just tells you that the amount of attacks that have been taking place by the Russians on air defense is something which is interesting. If the president of the country is itself saying that he needs more air defense systems, small amounts of older systems have been promised by the Americans, the Germans, and I think the Israelis also are getting into the act. I'll talk about that in a little bit, so stay tuned for that. Of course, the cruise missile attacks are taking place. We've seen the Caliber, we've seen many other attacks. There are rumors of MiG-31s flying around in Belarus trying to do practice attacks with their hypersonic systems that they've got. So there's a lot which is in the pipeline. There's a lot of misinformation which is coming across. I just call it missile attacks and air attacks. I would not want to get into what kind of missile and what kind of air attacks are taking place because these are something that is open to discussion. Of course, as I mentioned to you in the map, there is a city called Bakhmut. It is supposed to be, and this is as per Ukrainian accounts, the linchpin of the Ukrainian defense in the east. It's supposed to be a garrison town. It is supposed to be a cross point for railway, for roadways, for electricity, and a whole lot of other things. The Wagner Group, which is a private army or a mercenary army of the Russians, is conducting attacks within this region, and there is, as we speak, door to door and street to street fighting taking place in that region. There are certain visuals which are coming out which are very scary because you can literally see buildings after buildings just brought down to the ground. So one can actually know with the kind of concentration that we saw on the map with the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces, the kind of fighting that would be taking place would be terrible. The Telegraph, who sent, there's a screenshot here on your screen, who sent a couple of journalists. I think this report was published on the 15th. You can check it out online as well. The frontline city where Russia is making gains, and it talks about the mercenary Wagner Group, who's basically making advances within this region. I kind of disagree with this particular report in one reason because they're trying to kind of push across the criticality of this city called Bakhmut. They are saying that it may not be that important as what it is being put out to be. But if you read Ukrainian accounts, you can actually realize how critical this particular city is, because the Ukrainian accounts themselves are talking about almost 30,000 Ukrainians defending that city and the region around it. So one can actually realize the importance. Apart from that, just to compare, when I mentioned the number of manpower, 30,000 troops to defend Bakhmut, and there are about 15 or 20,000 troops which are taking place in an offensive next to Kherson. So you can actually imagine the importance of Bakhmut, which is being given even by the Ukrainians themselves. Let's move on. Terrain. This is something I really want to talk about. The Ukrainians conducted this lightning fast offensive in the beginning of September, where the world said, now Russia has taken a back foot, Ukraine is going to win the war, and we saw the Russians basically folding back and retreating. It was a fighting retreat that the Russians put out, and they reversed back into positions that they could have defended a little better. Now, why did they do that? And why is it that we see the amount of territory that has been taken back or by reconquered or re-established control over by Ukraine seems to be a little large? Terrain plays a big role in terms of warfare. When we talk about India-China warfare, one of the biggest things that we talk about is the mountainous region, and mountains favor the defenders. That's something which is known. Of course, to fight in the mountains, for the Chinese to attack in the mountains, would need a superiority in terms of manpower, which would be close to 1:9. So for every one Indian soldier, they would need 9 Chinese soldiers to come in and attack Indian positions within the Himalayas. It's not that simple. Having said that, the terrain where the fighting is happening today is basically flatlands with very few hills, very few kind of features on the land, no rocks or tree setups and stuff like that. Remember, Ukraine is also a very large agrarian country. They produce a lot of wheat. So this particular area in the east is the most productive in terms of the wheat cultivation of the country, and the land that where this fighting is currently happening in Kherson, in Kharkiv in the northeast, is basically flat, steep land. So once you kind of get into something, you have to go back to a position where you can defend yourself, which has some sort of an obstacle, probably a high ground somewhere, probably behind in a bunch of trees, or probably behind artificially made defense lines. So it's very critical for us to understand that as fast as a terrain can be occupied, it can also be recaptured in a counter attack. So terrain is something that we must keep into picture when we are talking about this particular war, because currently, as I said, the terrain is relatively flat. It is like, for people watching in India, it is like, basically, I don't know how many of you've been there, but the run of Kutch is flat. There are no features altogether. Although there are certain features which are available in this region of Kherson and Kharkov in the north. There are rolling, very small hills. There are some tree lines. There are some small towns which are there and villages which become defensive lines, and that is where I see the battle forming into a defensive line, both by the side of the Russians and by the side of the Ukrainians, wherever the Russians are in offensive. So it's a common thread that we can see as a tactic between both the armies, and that's something I wanted to put across to clear the air, because I haven't seen a certain discussion till now, especially within many a circles within India and abroad, where terrain is specifically discussed. This is an interesting article that came out from the Europe News, Euro News, as per se. It talks about US and Europe are running out of weapons to send to Ukraine. This was published on the 28th of September. It says, and I quote, the US weapons industry in normal production levels for artillery shells for the 155 millimeter howitzer, long range gun, is about 30,000 rounds a year. And it says the Ukrainian soldiers fighting the Russian forces would go through that in roughly 2 weeks. That means the Ukrainians would be fighting and using about 2,200 odd rounds a day. And that's something, 2,000, yeah, 100, 200 rounds a day. And that's something we can calculate with the amount of weapons that would have been given. And this is something which has been established by many another, war watchers who've said the kind of artillery fire that has been taking place between both the Ukrainians and the Russians. And this can further be established by this study that was done by Rusi. This was done in June. This was published. You can actually check this out. It is on the website. It's an open website, so you can read it. It's a long article, but I've just taken out certain things which talk about the artillery fire capability of both actually the Russians, and some amount of anti-tank missiles that are much in question, like the javelins and so on and so forth. This talks about industrial warfare. This talks about the capacity of a country to manufacture arms for its war fighting capabilities. And this is very critical for India. For those of us who are watching, please understand, war can be fought if you have the capacity to manufacture the ammunition. And that is one of the reasons, I guess, the Indian armed forces are looking at more indigenous ammunition and more indigenous weapons, so that the procurement of the ammunition for these weapons could be easier than from outside. So let's see what they have to say. They said, and this, by the way, is a study that they conducted in April, May. So it'll give you a relative picture. It won't really tell you what is happening on the ground today, right? They said about 390 daily fire missions are taken up by the Russian artillery, which are basically tube artillery. This is apart from the rockets and stuff like that. It says that an average of 7,000 rounds per day was fired, and the report says about 1,500 rounds is what the average of Ukrainians are firing on towards the Russians. I know I said about 2,000 because that's the calculation I could get from there, but this report actually mentions about 1,500 rounds. So you can see the kind of difference in terms of the artillery barrage that each one of the armies can put across. The Russians have been using artillery as a weapon of dominance, and they use this in very, very high quantities in order to push back the Ukrainians in whatever little whatever offensives that the Ukrainians are conducting. There are times where the reports have come out where the Russians have allowed the Ukrainians to come into a certain area which is marked. They've retreated out of that particular area. These areas are artillery marked, and when the Ukrainians come inside, it's ridiculous and horrible. And this is not something that I'm talking about. These are interviews which have been done by foreign fighters who are fighting in Ukraine. These are Western foreign fighters that have come out and given interviews and spoken about the tactics that the Russians have been following in order to use their uh, their their artillery fire. Right. Let's talk about the missiles, and especially the Javelin was discussed in this particular report. It talks about Lockheed Martin, who produces this particular missiles, can produce about 2,100 missiles a year. The number would have ramped up to about 4,000 in the last few years, and the Ukrainians are claiming to use about 400 to 500 missiles a day. So you can imagine what they're producing in a year can be finished in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 days, right? So it's something that is not uh, uh, is not viable for the Ukrainians to continue with this sort of a fire use, and it will not be viable for the West to kind of keep supplying. And as in the second report, the first report that I showed you, it said US and Europe are running out of weapons. So I established my point with this particular report. Now, again, coming back to the position, there are reports that the Ukrainians are still on the offensive. Uh, these are actual gains on the ground, keeping in mind the terrain. This is actually politics to put across a certain message to the world, or these are basically done for optics, for ensuring that the supply of money and weapons keeps on at Ukrainian behest, and Ukraine is supported no matter what happens. Remember, winter is coming, so things will change. How big will be the Russian offensive is a question. Again, a lot of people are asking. They want to know whether the Russians will fight with their doctrine, which is all out offensives, hard amount of use of firepower, and huge amounts of manpower going inside at the same time, shock and awe sort of tactics which will be taking place. I'm not very sure how that will go forward, because the Russians at the moment are not giving very clear hints as to their objectives when that particular offensive will begin. But having said that, the offensive will happen, and that is something that we can see. I'd also like to put a thought across to all of you guys to comment on, and please do leave your thoughts in the comments column. Is that, are these missile strikes today uh, part of basically an attack, an aerial attack, which is taking place on Ukraine, a precursor to this particular invasion? That's something that we'll have to see. General Mud is on right now in the middle of October. So General Mud is on full power. It is going to go from General Mud to General Winter. And that General Winter, as we all know, as we all have studied our history, does support Russia in a large particular aspect. The Russians are used to fighting in that particular winter. Their equipment is used to fighting in that winter. Their equipment is hardy and used in that particular terrain, environment, and condition. Of course, there is also General Armageddon, General Zurovikin, who's just been given the overall command of the Ukrainians. Remember, this is the same general who was fighting the ISIS in Syria, and what the ISIS had to say about him, if you can read, was only one simple word, that was brutal. I wonder what is being planned for this particular offensive, which will be coming forward. And if I had my say, I would push the West and Ukraine to sit down on the negotiation table before this offensive comes in and destroys what is left of their country. Some of you were actually questioning Elon Musk. I think Arun, yeah, I'm just going to put up your comment. You say Elon Musk tweeted yesterday that he would continue to support the Ukrainian even if the Pentagon does not pay. Well, I have a bit of a different theory. The payment is one aspect of it. Please understand, Elon Musk spent about $8 or $9 billion making this particular system to a point where he could actually exercise this kind of control over a battlefield, or actually provide this as a service to the battlefield. Uh, I don't know if it's the payment where these glitches are happening, or the Russians have been able to jam his systems, and that is where he's kind of creating this whole tamasha about the payments. uh, $100 million a month, I don't think the Americans would flinch once to give it to Elon Musk to shut him up. But in my opinion, I think Elon is coming under a certain pressure with regards to battlefield operations, where these systems are now being jammed by Russian counter, electronic offensives, and that's one of the reasons why these little systems have been seen to have failed in a couple of the offensives that have taken place. Uh, I kind of think that there is something to it. I don't have any proof to give you guys, but this is just something I think about as a possibility that is happening on the last. Nuclear rhetoric is basically gone. We've we don't see any acrimonious comments coming from the West. Especially today is the day the NATO nuclear exercises start, and I've made a video about this nuclear exercises. So please do have a watch at that. I've put across my thoughts as to what is the purpose of these nuclear exercises, and were there the right time to do it at the moment? Well, the simple answer would be no, but there has to be certain reasons that I've elucidated in that particular video, so you can check it out. The narrative machine, that is something I want to talk about, and I'm writing an article about this particular thing, the narrative war, and how it has evolved from day one, from the days of the coast of Kiev to today. The narrative machine was glory to Ukraine at one time, where they said, glory to the Ukrainian soldiers and they are doing a great job and this and that. Let's also see the narrative which is picking up today. The narrative that is picking up today is the Russians are getting pushed back and this and that. And after the missile attacks, the narrative is coming out to be the Russians are heartless. So it is a shifting narrative because of the shifting conditions of the war. We need to see how this narrative will build forward, coming at the end of the autumn, and of course coming to the beginning of winter. This is an interesting news that came out, which is happening on the northern front of Ukraine, where the Russians have sent about 9,000 soldiers to Belarus, and they say that this is basically to form a joint defensive force. Remember, the Belarusians, and I'll just show you the map once again, have about I think about a border of about 1,000 kilometers. With this is the border right here on the north. It's about 1,000 kilometers of a border with Ukraine. So I'm sure they either are a bit nervous or as to what is happening, or there is something to it. That's something that we need to find out. But at the premise of it, if I'm going to agree this particular report, and remember, I may be trying to tell you about the Ukrainian narrative. The Russians are no good either. This is war, and the first casualty of war is truth itself. So take everything with a pinch of salt. 9,000 soldiers that are there are not enough to carry out an offensive from the north towards Kiev. The maximum that probably those guys would be able to do is set up artillery shelling and stuff like that, and probably fix some amount of Ukrainian troops on the northern border to make their lives a little easier in the east. I really don't know what's exactly happening over there, because Lukashenko talks about the threat from the west towards his country. He talks about a threat from Poland. There's a lot of politics within this entire thing. There's a lot of game within this entire thing. And Poland, for one, a lot of the Russians are not trusting today because they are the one of the most vocal anti-Russian European country that we can see today. It is hurting them beyond anything, but I guess they've got their own reasons. There is another reason that I think of is that the Belarusians, who have a very old army, they've got very old equipment, they've not kind of bothered to upgrade it for a long time. I think the Russians are trying to bring them up to speed to a certain thing. And these 9,000 soldiers seems to be advisors or trainers that have come to train up the Belarusians in the new sort of equipment that the Russians are giving them. The Russian Air Force have also positioned MiG-31s and I believe some large strategic bombers on the Russian borders. The MiG-31s have been positioned in Belarus, and there are videos. I'm sure you can see them flying around in on the skies of Minsk. These probably are an answer to the NATO nuclear drills or something else. It's difficult at this moment to kind of realize. Having said that, these MiG-31s, remember, are capable of carrying the Russian hypersonic missiles. Uh, these things would be able to fire hypersonic missiles whilst in Belarusian territory, far away, deep within Ukraine. So that is something one must keep in mind when we are talking about this. The Russians or the Belarusians are not talking about this, as a matter of fact. As I said, Lukashenko says all this is defensive. And the question that I asked is 9,000 troops, what can they do? Now, the impact of the Ukraine war, and gentlemen and ladies who are joining me today, please do join me tomorrow night with Major General Rajiv Narayan, who's going to be talking about the impact that this Ukraine war is going to have on Europe, on America, and many other parts of the world. I think a lot of us have been itching to have that discussion. I wanted to have that discussion with someone who has a pulse on this particular area. He's been talking to some various people about it, very important people in that particular region about it. He has a lot of base knowledge. So let's get into it with him, and we'll do a live session to understand what exactly would be the impact on geopolitics going forward. I'm also working on a video where we will talk about globalism and probably the decline or what is going to happen to this whole concept. Let's move forward. Israel is sending weapons, and that's something which was a big surprise to me. Why is Israel sending offensive weapons into Ukraine? And that is something where I did not understand what was the purpose of sending these weapons. But one thing I can make out with the whole narrative reality, I'm not very sure of these Iranian drones being used in Russia. I guess Israel doesn't want to fall back. But having said that, I'd like to caution the Israelis. These drones seem to be pretty potent, and I will try and get somebody to have a discussion on this particular thing. I'm working on that. These drones seem to be a bit potent, and the Western powers are kind of scrambling to find out how to counter these particular drones. So there's a bit of a challenge right there. The Saudi-US relations have taken a twist. There is statements flying around from both the sides. There's somebody from the US talking about removing all the troops from Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are talking about the US being oversensitive about things and not understanding the Saudi situation itself. And they're now talking about Arabian interests being paramount. I think everybody's kind of taking a line out of Mr. Jaishankar's book. Good for them. Anyways, sweet. Now, I want to talk about this Nord Stream thing. I'd done the video on this where I pointed out as to what my thought process was, who could have done this attack. There are three aspects of it where I said one is the intent, two is the capability, and three is the benefit. Anytime we see something like this, these are the three things that we need to see. I'm sure the investigators are doing a better job than what I could have done. Jokes apart, Sweden today says, I'm not going to join a joint probe. Why is something which is very curious. Sweden is potentially a part of the NATO, which is he's wanting to be a part of NATO. So that's something a bit curious. Why is he not wanting to do that? And of course, he's also not wanting to share the investigation findings with Russia. It is interesting, and they cite national security for this. It is interesting when something like this is spoken about because either the Swedes have found something and it is pointing towards a particular country. There was a rumor that the Germans put out a notification that they knew who the attackers were and they're not going to come out and say it. But anyways, these are all huffs and tuffs which happen online, but I'm not going to pay too much heed. This is something that has been reported by Euronews. It talks about Sweden not wanting to share the Nord Stream investigation findings with Russia. It's it's a murky scenario, and let me assure you, I haven't seen mainstream media discussions about something like this. If something like this would have happened in Western Europe or the Americas or probably in Japan or something like that, the entire story would have been completely different. I'm sure the world media would have been at it and trying to figure out who did that. The German industry is in a precarious position. Of course, the gas shortages, especially after the Nord Stream gone off, are going to be bad. They're trying to reconnect themselves towards the expensive American gas, but the industry leaders are not confident, and they are absolutely putting out alarm bells. There are protests happening in Europe that I will talk about. And my next point that I say is Europe. The euro is in crisis. The euro is in crisis for only two reasons. Euro is Germany, and if Germany falls, there's going to be problems. Right? Let's also look at another sector in the West where there are questions being raised today. There is a report that was put out by an American economic think tank, which is fearing a real estate slowdown. And this was actually also very beautifully elucidated in a talk that Professor Gurumurthy had done with the Republic TV, and it's something that you must watch. He's spoken about a changing global world order that's not been articulated by a lot of people in the world. Looking at that and taking the premise of that, along with the American report, if we are looking at a real estate slowdown, remember the American economy is based on a large amount of real estate, just as the Chinese. If that particular thing happens, then America is in big trouble. They are actually in as it is big trouble because there are fears of recession, and Joe Biden is kind of spoke about it. He says that the American economy is strong as ever. Only time will tell. At the moment, the midterms are coming in, so I guess there is going to be a row of positivity which will be put across by the favorable media and the favorable Western narrative outlets with regards to the American economy, apart from anything else. Let's move forward. This is reported by the Bloomberg. As I was talking to you about the American economy, JP Morgan boss says that landing is unlikely. Interest rates will likely rise more than estimates. Uh, the funny part of the Americans are that they're trying to control a real estate economy with hiking interest rates, where we've seen that as and when the interest rates are going up, the inflation is not getting connected. And again, this was very, very beautifully elucidated by Dr. Gurumurthy in that particular talk. Really request all of you to please have a look at that. I'm no fan of any particular channel, but when there is some good stuff, I'm going to say it myself. There is another report that came out from the Copernicus Climate Change Service, which is based in the EU, which talks about Europe is supposed to have an unusually warm winter. This is either pacification of some kind which is happening for the European population, or this is actually a reality. But let me tell you, when you talk about a mild or a warm winter in Europe, it is still very cold. It is still going to snow, and there are reports of German forests going gayab, if I may. I couldn't find a better word for that. Let's move forward. This is something which is very interesting, and I wanted to actually put this across because this is Radio Genova who's tweeted this out. Uh, and I'm going to quote. It says sanctions on Russia have destroyed European businesses and families. The Germans understood this. Protest every day against Ursula von der Leyen and the EU are real enemies who said 7 months ago, in 10 days, Russia will go bankrupt. And in the end, we Europeans went bankrupt. Now, Radio Genova is not a very known outlet, but this particular statement and the kind of crowd that I see at the back is something to be reckoned with. It's not something that the European government should put down. I think it's absolutely critical that this thing is looked at very carefully by Europe. The last slide, and I want to talk about this in a funny way. Narratives are pretty good if they are based on a certain amount of reality, just a little bit. This is a narrative that we see all the time coming from the West, and it talks about Russia, who wants to dominate the entire, Eastern Europe. They want to take back all the Soviet territories. Putin is pro-Soviet, and he's from the Soviet time, and this and that. Well, I don't know about Putin. I haven't met the guy, so I'm not going to comment on his personal thoughts. But having said that, this is a statement that is coming across from the West quite a bit. And in the next breath, they also say that the Russian army is weak and can't fight. Look, the Ukrainian small army is defeating them. I'm not sure as to what needs to be believed. And this is a big problem in this war for people like me who want to actually understand what is happening in this war. You can't cut through the clutter. It is, and the worst part about the whole thing is these kind of narratives are not coming out of silly media outlets. These are coming out of head of states who probably are not looking after their one statement from their other and making this kind of sense. That's all I have in terms of the presentation. There are certain comments, I'll go through them. Let's see what you guys have to say. Aditya, thank you so much for waiting in the line before the show started, by the way. He was there. Thank you so much for that. Makes me feel very good. Udit says Russians have activated the dragon teeth. Well, yeah, you know what? It is quite possible. I don't know how this offensive I don't know how this offensive is going to go forward but if I look at the Russian doctrine and they follow that particular doctrine, things look a little dangerous, because one of the things that they're doing is in certain regions in Ukraine where force collection is happening, the Russians have asked the civilian population to kind of evacuate from that entire area. So that is a bit dicey. I don't know what's going to happen. Right. Before I again go into the questions, guys, please hit the like button. Check your subscription. Check the bell notification. I'm going to try and do more and more videos to try and cover up more and more stuff. I figure the one of the ways to grow on YouTube would be to have more and more videos on this thing. And of course, yeah, I want to ask all of you guys a question. Do you think I should also start probably a program or two in Hindi where I'm going to start talking about various geopolitical events? uh, Let me know in the comments. Let me know in your personal thoughts. And a lot of us are connected on the WhatsApp group, so please do let me know. And those of you who want to join the WhatsApp group, please do send me a number on my email address, and of course a way for me to verify who you are. I'm saying that because I had a few unrequired requests. Right. Mandar says if electricity is targeted, civilians will suffer and Ukrainians will become under immense pressure. You're absolutely correct. There's no question about it. It is part of the entire shock and awe beginning of an invasion where the civilian population would be made to become a little more uncomfortable. Till now, Kiev was a normal city. For those of the people that have gone there, there are bars, pubs, restaurants, everything's kind of on. People are having a semi sort of a normal life. But having said that, yeah, it does make a huge difference in terms of in terms of what is happening. Elon Musk tweeted yesterday, and I discussed this, Arun. So yeah, Russia had a hand uh, to resort to drone attacks as a reply to Ukraine's attack on civilian structures. Russian city of Belgorod, where 5 civilians were killed. Well, I kind of have a little bit of a problem with regards to this whole tit for tat kind of a thing, because if army is going to get into tit for tat, this war will never end, because somebody's going to have the last word. So it's a I understand where the Russians are coming from, and if I was a Russian, I would say the same thing, revenge. But it's just something I feel, right? Mr. Cosmic Bliss, I'm not going to even try and pronounce the first word. Uh, Taking out Elon's stat as a practice session could be a possibility. Well, taking it out would be hard intervention. I think softer intervention in terms of jamming them would be something that the Russians would be looking at, and blinding of them, as I think Arun mentioned here would be something, this thing. And thanks, Arun, for that comment. As I said, there are reports about Elon Musk has spoken about it. Some other people have spoken about jamming of these systems, and they've tried to kind of create problems for them in terms of communication. There was an offensive. I don't know where, but the news was that there was an offensive that was conducted where the Ukrainians literally needed to run back because their comm sets were off. Either they were jammed or they were. I'm not sure. There's an interesting question here. India has purchased a lot of weapons from Russia. Isn't it now known to India that Russians' weapons don't work? I don't think so. I'll respectfully disagree with you, Mr. Kalyan. Please understand the way that this war has been fought is, compare it with the way that we fought our war in Kargil. There were restrictions which were put across on the Russian forces where they could not use the kind of force that their doctrine allows them to. Blaming certain weapons and this and that, certain weapon systems, will not be fair, because weapons are not the only ones that actually win or lose a war. It is the men, the army, the logistics, the positioning, the terrain as very important thing. You can have the best of weapons in the most wrong terrain, it will not work. So it's there's a lot of factors that go into this particular thing. So I'd actually keep it at a very broader perspective, wherein this thing, and Rupesh says Putin is hiding the Russian objective very well. Well, to an extent, yes. I don't know what the offensive's objectives will be, but the special military operations objectives were very clearly defined. uh, I don't know whether the special military operation is still continuing, or is this going to convert into some sort of a mini anti-terrorist operation, or what sort. Why I say this is because there was a thing that the Russians had done during the second Chechen war. They converted their sort of an operation to a special counter-terrorist operation, where they went in and pretty much, finished everything off and got the war over with. Right, next. Sir, is US really thinking to fight till the last Ukrainian? What are your views on this? Well, it's pretty evident, sir. Uh, they are, if not anything else, they're trying to fight till the last Ukrainian. And the position of Ukraine today, and there are a lot of military experts that are talking about the kind of losses that the Ukrainians have had. Some people term it at about 100,000 dead. Some people term it at a little more. Some people term it at a little less. When you talk about deaths in a war, please also remember it's about 2 or 3 times of the number that people have died also get wounded. So that's a casualty rate about 200 to 300,000 men. Uh, no matter how big the country is, it to sustain that kind of losses is just not feasible. It is just not feasible. How far they'll be able to sustain it is something, very, very difficult to realize. Uh, would you be discussing the nuclear doctrine of Russia, if there isn't much content on this topic with regards to Hindi programs? Please do host some sessions in collab with Jaipur Dialogues. Well, as a matter of fact, I've had Mr. Sanjay Dixit on the show twice. It is an interesting discussion I always have with him. I'm planning to do something in the next week. I'll let you guys know, and most likely I'll speak to Mr. Dixit if he's open to doing a live show, so that all of you can also be there. As far as content of the Russian nuclear doctrine, please check out a video I made last week on the nuclear threats which are taking place, NATO's nuclear exercise. I think the video is called. Check it out. I have kind of elucidated as to what the Russian doctrine is with regards to this thing. I've also written an article about it, which is in the Financial Express. You can go to that and read what I've written about the Russian nuclear doctrine and the whole story and the propaganda of this particular game. The last comment that I'd like to take, Mr. Raju Ram, is there's a lot of propaganda of Russian weapons, making them look inferior than the Western ones, saying old Soviet tech, but they're afraid to use the F-35s against S-400s. It is interesting when these kind of things happen, because a lot of these weapons that they're talking about, we don't know what is being used on the ground. All we know is from certain accounts that are coming out, certain photographs that are coming out. There was a time when they were talking about the Russians taking out their old T-54 tanks and putting it out. These kind of people forget that Russia even now has an arsenal of about 50,000 tanks, which are, their army reserve, which is kept there. They don't have a shortage of equipment. I don't see it here. As a matter of fact, the Iranian drone thing, everybody's saying that they've gone to Iran because they're running out of this thing. I think they've gone to Iran because they found a cheaper alternative to do the same damn thing that they were doing with more expensive, more precise missiles from their own stuff. So they found a cheaper, more inaccurate sort of a version of something. Probably inaccurate. I'm just making a guess. Remember, Iranian drones and Iranian weapons are made with commercially available equipment, because Iran is under sanctions. So they're probably easy to fit, easy to repair, easy to use, and much cheaper. So that's something I find as a probability. Please understand, war is expensive. Each one of these cruise missiles sometimes cost up to $60,000. So it's not something that is easy to fire a cruise missile and just waste that kind of money. Of course, thank you so much, guys, for those of you who joined me. And I wish that a lot of the people that are going to watch me after this video is published, I will try and, as I said, do more and more videos, solos, sometime in the afternoons like this, where I'm going to put out a certain amount of research that I keep doing on my own, some articles that I keep writing, where you'll be able to get an insight into some topics that are not much spoken about around the world. Couple of things I'm working on, just to give you a little insight, is that Joe Biden's comment about Pakistan and nuclear seems to be a little interesting to me. A lot of people are bowing Bangladesh, but I have a bit of caution, and I don't think it meant what we think it meant. Let me just leave that at there, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe, do hit the bell icon so that you get notifications. I've been getting complaints from some of you that I haven't, my notifications don't come to you. Sorry about that. Please ensure that the notifications are there. And please, if you do want to join this WhatsApp, Dev Talks WhatsApp channel, just send me a message or an email on my email address mentioned in the channel with your number and some way for me to identify who you are. A social media handle, an active social media handle would be preferred. I've been getting some requests from very friendly neighbors of ours where I, not like to keep them a little away, because the kind of discussion and the kind of learned discussion that happens on the Dev Talk WhatsApp channel is something which is very interesting. I'm also going to come up with a new feature for my channel, guys, very soon. I'll announce it. Till then, do check out my website, www.thedevtalks.com. Read my articles, watch the older videos, and of course, yes, if you can, do contribute to the Dev Talks efforts. I'm trying to collect something to get rid of that StreamYard icon right there, get some more branding in my this thing, so that I can look a little more professional in my outlook. Till next time, as I said, tomorrow in the night, where with General Rajiv Narayan, we discuss the impact of the Ukraine war. Jai Hind.